Could you maybe just start, Liza, by telling us a little bit about exactly what IBS is?
Well, with IBS or irritable bowel syndrome, if you go by the textbook definition, there's a tick box of 3 things that you have to have the full-blown IBS, the syndrome. So it is looking at a 3-month period where you have to have pain in the pelvis, and then there has to be a relation to opening your bowels, a change in stool frequency, or a change in the appearance of your stool, which could be either a change from diarrhea to constipation, or normal to constipation, normal to diarrhea. And then there are other signs where the box does not have to be ticked, but they are corroborating the diagnosis, and one of them is bloating.
And what are the links between endometriosis and IBS?
Well, when I first started as a very junior doctor, there seemed to be sort of the opinion that you either had IBS or endometriosis, but there's now mounting evidence that people with endometriosis more frequently have IBS type symptoms. So they might not tick all the boxes of IBS, these Rome criteria I just mentioned, but I often hear this story that people have excessive bloating. There's a relation to opening bowels, for instance. Pain is relieved by opening bowels, or they have a tendency to develop diarrhea or constipation. And the underlying mechanisms that might link endometriosis and IBS could be through inflammation. So endometriosis is an inflammatory disorder, and because the uterus and ovaries are so closely related to the bowels, the inflammation goes jump over. And the other thing that might be happening is something called pain sensitization or visceral hypersensitivity, which means that the body is on high alert when it comes to any pain sensation. And thirdly, sometimes in very, very advanced forms of endometriosis, the normal passage of the bowel is slightly diverted, and the food has to travel a little diversion, and the passage of food is slowed down. So it often sits in a spot either in the over the left hip bone or over the right hip bone, and then there can be localized bloating. And where there's bloating, there's often bowel cramping that shows itself in pain.
So are people with endometriosis more susceptible to having IBS as well, or is it that the IBS is exacerbated by someone's endometriosis?
Both.
Okay.
Both. I had patients who had all the endometriosis removed after surgery, and they still had sensitive bowels. I didn't call it IBS because they didn't have all the Rome criteria, but I called it sensitive bowels. And so a good look at other things like medication to be avoided or certain foods to be avoided is part of a holistic management of that. So then after surgery, managing the bowels carefully can make a big, big difference.
Okay, so if someone is having IBS type symptoms, does that mean that their endometriosis is more likely to be in their bowel, or is that separate, do you think?
I think that is separate, apart from this very localized bloating that comes with the scarring and the diversion of the large bowel. That is where once the bowel is released and the passage of food is smoother, oftentimes this localized bloating is then actually improved by surgery. IBS is one of these diseases where it is an invisible condition, so you can't really look at these bowels or do colonoscopy and make the diagnosis of IBS, because the architecture of the bowel looks normal. It's not behaving in the way it should.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you. And how can people that are experiencing IBS symptoms look after themselves? Are there any foods or anything like that that people should seek to avoid to help manage this?
Yeah, I think when it comes to food, the chemicals within the food, they're called fermentable carbs, make IBS worse. These compounds can be in sugary fruits, gluten, dairy, pulses, and some artificial sweeteners. So in some individuals, one or more of these food groups can cause fermentation of these foods whilst the food is sitting in the large bowel, and that can cause excessive bloating and in some cases diarrhea. So it would be a possible approach looking at all these food groups, and then give yourself 2 weeks where you strictly remove that particular food group from your diet, and have a food pain diary at the same time to note down if your pain has actually improved, because if it is improved, you know you found the culprit. And if it's not improved, you can start eating that particular food group again and move on to the next one. And from my experience, the most common are lactose, which is in dairy products, and gluten, which is in wheat and rye. So these seem to be the main culprits, and that is also backed up by some early research studies. When it comes to medication, one type of medication to try and avoid would be lactulose. You might have heard of lactulose as a laxative, so it is often used for constipation, and in people who are sensitive to milk sugar, that can cause excessive bloating, so that would be a laxative to be avoided. And opioids, which are painkillers of the morphine family, tramadol, codeine, phosphate, these are examples. They can cause slowing down of the passage of food, and that would give the food more time to ferment. So bloating and constipation is a common side effect.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. And are there any medications that people can take for IBS as well as managing their diet and so on?
Yes, it depends a little bit how the IBS manifests itself. So, for instance, if IBS shows itself in constipation, just having a spoon of linseed in the morning with plenty of fluid could help, because linseed forms a sort of matrix around each seed, and that helps with constipation. And it is also one of these foods that is very good for the gut. You might have read about probiotics, which are good bugs that we all carry in our guts. And linseed is an example of the foods that feed these good bacteria. So regular linseed with plenty of fluid is a really good idea. Then for bloating, there are herbal remedies available, and there's over-the-counter medication available as well. Heat is often felt as something that is soothing, and then sort of a yoga position that's very good for bloating and trapped wind, where you basically lie on your back and then you bend one knee and hug it into your chest. So that is really good at shifting trapped wind.
Thank you. No, that's really, really helpful. And in terms of research, you mentioned research a little bit earlier. How much research is going on into things like diet and food and the impacts that that has on someone's endometriosis symptoms or
Yeah,
IBS?
there is work going on in Denmark that actually looked at the FODMAP diet, and I'm happy to provide a link to the diet sheet. So this Danish study looked at benefits of a low FODMAP diet in endometriosis patients, and this study is finished, so we're waiting for the results to be published.
No, thank you. That'd be great if you could send a link to that, and I'll put it in the down bar below. Thank you. No, that's great. And I guess a lot of people listening as well might be struggling to actually get an endometriosis diagnosis and might be being told that it's IBS that they're experiencing and it's not endo. Do you have any advice for people when they're going to their GP and the GP might be saying, we're not going to investigate endometriosis because we think you've got IBS? Do you have any tips for anybody that's in that situation?
Yes, I think what would be really a very strong pointer towards endometriosis is if you brought a pain diary, which is something that you could start during the lockdown, where it's becoming a pain diary that shows that your pain is linked to periods. So either prior to a period or during a period, if the pain is linked with sex, and if there's also subfertility. These would be all pointers towards endometriosis, and that would be not as suggestive of irritable bowel syndrome, although it can sometimes get stronger during periods, but the link with endometriosis is much stronger. So a pain diary and pointing out that pain occurs during sex, if that's the case, that you've been trying for a baby for over a year, that would be a stronger pointer towards endometriosis being there or being there in combination with irritable bowel syndrome. And then a vaginal examination might show that there's spot tenderness at the top of the vagina, or the uterus is tilted backwards. These are, again, pointers towards endometriosis. And then an ultrasound scan that sometimes shows pointers towards endometriosis, such as ovarian cysts. So all of these things would go for endometriosis rather than for irritable bowel syndrome.
Thank you so much for explaining that. That's going to be really helpful for a lot of people. So thank you. And that's all the questions that we had sent through to us, Liza. I don't know if there's anything else that you'd like to add, perhaps around how people can help themselves with their IBS or anything else.
I think now where people are working in a slightly different way, and some of us have more times on their hand, it might be valuable to utilize that time and take a really close look at how food choices can have an effect on pain, and diarize that. I often find it's useful to put this FODMAP diet sheet on your fridge with a magnet as a reminder to look into that, and give yourself 10 days where you leave out one of these food groups and then move through the whole table. So by the end of the lockdown, you've become your own food doctor, and you might have found a cure for the aspect of your pain that was caused by sensitive bowels.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thank you ever so much for joining us, Liza. Really appreciate your time at what I know is an incredibly busy time for you in the NHS. So thanks, Liza.